All right, great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Conversations in Agave. I'm Susan Koss with Mezcalistas. I'm really excited to be speaking this evening with Niki Nakazawa and Max Rosenstock with Neta Spirits. I've had the pleasure of knowing these guys for a long time. Basically, I met Max when we first started Mezcalistas, when we hosted these underground speakeasy parties, and Max was there with Mike Whipple, and we got an early peek at some of the stuff that he was working on. So I fully admit to being a gigantic fan of these guys and really loving the work that they've been doing over time. So great to see you guys. Why don't you just kind of give a little bit of background for folks that are joining us who may not know how Neta got started. Niki, how you got involved. Max, so I don't know which one of you wants to go first.
Sure. Well, Neta kind of was started very informally in 2012. Niki and I met in late 2012 in Mexico City, where she had been living at the time. And you know, we didn't really know how to move forward for a while and had some very different ideas about what was possible or not possible. And, you know, one thing led to another. I ended up coming to Oaxaca full time. Niki ended up making the transition and moving down to Oaxaca. And in 2018, we were finally able to really get things off the ground. Yusuke as well, our third partner, was pretty instrumental in that, who came along in 2017. Yeah, it's turned into a situation where we are pretty much full-time working with the community of Logoche. There are some other communities and other individuals, families with whom we also work with. But the project has become fairly specific to mezcal or destilado de agave from Miahuatlan. Yeah, there's a whole lot more, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that, you know, Max in 2012 had been spending a lot of time between Oakland and Oaxaca, and he would make his way through Mexico City, which is where I was living. And so kind of at the same time that you, Susan, and Mezcalistas was getting started and having these clandestine underground speaking parties around things, you know, we were also engaged in this type of behavior or activities in Mexico City. So we have Max kind of coming through Mexico City en route to Oakland. Yeah, dropping off mezcal at my place there. My partner at the time, he has a record label called Nafi. And I had a pop-up restaurant called Pichon. And so we would do these underground speakeasy parties in Mexico City. And Max would sling mezcal and, you know, gather funds to continue his research. I would cook, and Tomas, he would organize the music. And so we started that way. And the folks that Max was buying mezcal from at that time were the producers that we work with currently. So I got involved informally, just getting mezcal in people's glasses in Mexico City. And as folks from the States were coming through Mexico City and maybe didn't have a chance to go to Oaxaca, I would do little tastings out of my apartment and you know, fill their bottles with a little funnel in my you know, living room. And you know, going from, you know, these types of informal gatherings of friends loving on this mezcal, we started getting a little bit more serious about making a business in 2015. And thank goodness, Yusuke Murayama, a very dear friend of mine who actually is a business person and has a background, he came through and he helped us, he kind of whipped us into shape and was like, you guys, you know, you have really something special here, and I think we can make it work in this way. And so that was really empowering and helped us make the decision finally to like come to Oaxaca and take this to the next place.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, it is really interesting because, you know, obviously when you guys first started out, the regulatory landscape was very different. The rules around mezcal were very different, you know, so it was like in 2012 and 2013, it was much easier to envision a project of bringing in small batch destillados into the States, just because there wasn't, you know, they hadn't really started on the hologram. NOM 70 hadn't happened yet. There was just a lot of looseness around it that made it more possible. So I'm sure that as you guys took the time to coalesce, the environment changed a little bit for you, and some of how you were making decisions of what you were going to do changed a little bit based on just the constantly changing laws at that time. But I was going to say, I remember when I would be in Oaxaca and I would say to people, oh yeah, I have this friend who's working on a project. His name is Max Rosenstock. And people would usually say, oh, is that the crazy gringo that just like goes out looking for mezcal in communities? And I'm just like, yeah, that's probably him. You know? But I mean, Max, can you just talk to like the approach that you took in how you met people and how you developed relationships?
So I really, you know, I'd had some exposure to mezcal from prior visits to Oaxaca in like 2002 and then again in 2006. But in 2012, I ended up spending a fairly substantial amount of time in the Sierra Sur, kind of equidistant between the city and the coast. And it's in the district of Miahuatlan. And even culturally, there are a lot of parallels between what's happening in the mountains and in the valley. And mezcal is one of those threads. And at that time, these communities in the mountains were still on the kind of old mezcal distribution routes that have existed for, you know, hundreds of years. Previously, most of the producers in Miahuatlan sold in the mountains and on the coast. And into the 70s, people were Francisco Garcia, who recently passed away in San Luis. He used to sell 1,000 liters every Monday to San Mateo, Rio Hondo, where I used to stay. Wow. And it's a town of roughly 1,200 people. And so that's how I met Francisco. But it gave me this exposure to not just a good mezcal, but also mezcal in its proper context, really, where it's kind of a social tool in a lot of ways, but really is kind of omnipresent. And there are certain formalities. You know, Mexico is very conservative in a lot of ways, especially in rural areas. And mezcal sometimes in these communities can play a role in those formalities. And so once I kind of realized that I wanted to learn more about this area, but needed a reason to be present in certain places, mezcal became this really wonderful avenue to get to try to understand more, which also obviously meant learning Spanish and being able to communicate with people. And it just led me to a lot of different villages and, you know, to a lot of different palenques. And after the course of a while, ended up in Logoche. And then, you know, just the dynamics in that community, and I think the desires that we had at Neta in terms of what we wanted to do with kind of our ability to maybe facilitate certain things that weren't really possible before and try to do business without being totally extractive. It just started to make sense to stay in Logoche and work with this particular community that is a bit of an anomaly in how its dynamics function. But, you know, surely there are other places like this, but Logoche is a really special place.
So how far is it from the city of Oaxaca?
In terms of...
Not as a bird flies.
Yeah, it's far, but it typically takes us about 2.5 hours to get out there.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of winding.
About
It's
And
not
like,
the easiest 2.5 hour drive.
yeah. And geographically, is it in a valley, mountains? Like, where does it
So
sit?
we're talking almost directly south of Oaxaca City. And Miahuatlan is the most southern of the Central Valleys and runs into the Sierra Madre del Sur. So you end up in kind of rolling country in some places, a lot of ravines in others, some kind of canyons, very mixed terrain. And so you really don't have a lot of flat land there, which also dictates people's relationship with the land and the type of cultivations that they can practice.
And I imagine that dictates relationships with other communities as well. I mean, in some of these villages, like you're very isolated from one another, and so your things are very community, because you're not traveling outside that much.
Yeah, and it's really easy to miss that today if you show up for the first time, or if you've shown up at all since like 2010. A lot of these roads are very new. And so what you think is maybe even a 20-year-old road is probably like 8 years old tops.
Or 3.
Exactly. And so it's easy to make assumptions about interconnectedness. And there is some to some degree, but it's very particular to certain communities. And you do have these like regional alliances, but then you also have your sort of semi-regional feuds. And there are villages not far away from where we hang out where people say, don't go there. They're all horrible people. And you go to those places and chances are they're going to say the same thing about, somebody else. And so history's, one thing. Times have changed a lot in recent years, and especially now with internet, which has arrived in Logoche in the last year. There's a new type of interconnectedness as well.
I mean, that was our last conversation, had Berta Vasquez on from her house in Chichicapa. And it was one of those amazing technological things that happen. But I want to go back to something that you said earlier, of, when you arrived in this village, and you started building kind of the business out. You really were looking at how to not have it be extractive. And I'm just, can you talk about that a little bit, and what extractive means, and the things that you tried to do to, I guess, to have a different relationship?
Sure. Well, in that sense, I think both of us are pretty sensitive to the colonial history here, and very aware of certain tropes and historical precedent. And so wanting to take that into consideration with most of our decision making, all of our decision making here, just the way we move on the ground as well. But in terms of extractiveness, I think that it's really easy for people in our position to show up and have access to these foreign markets. And, we didn't have money, but we were able to have access to money and that kind of thing. And so it's really easy to use that privilege and not really consider sort of the consequences of those business transactions. But then there's also the idea of looking at business as just business. And in working with these folks and with these communities, just like a dollar or peso transaction for leaders really isn't sufficient, at least in this circumstance. I'm sure there are producers in Mazatlan that are looking to sell mezcal to whoever shows up with money, but it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, I think that also when we speak about extractivism in this context, I think that there's a way in which if you're benefiting from labor in Mexico or in a rural community and then funding your life elsewhere, there's a way in which we making a life in the community where you work is also about having a stake in where we live and work, and trying to understand what it means to make a life and one which is interconnected with the people who we work with. And that it is a part of like a network of care. I think that it's coming to Oaxaca, it's so tremendously diverse, and we all have this desire and curiosity to explore, you know, the entire state and to want to be able to showcase the incredible richness of all the things that we encounter. But there's also a limit to one's ability to be in relationship or in right relationship with like people. And so I think that we're kind of trying to figure out like, how much can we, you know, how many people can we be in relation to in a way that's like present and meaningful. And you know, it's one's life's work. You know, there's people that you meet along the way that keep on enriching your life. But we were kind of like, okay, well, all these people are here. We have relationships with them. We are in, you know, giving and taking and you know, trying to be in a long-term relationship with this community. One which is not like, oh, well, you know, we'll be here for a few years, take what we can, and then like, you know, set up shop somewhere else. But that this is a long-term commitment that we have to one another, hopefully.
I mean, it's, you know, I think what's really interesting in a lot of these villages is, I mean, there's very much a communal concept of how they operate. And, you know, by you guys deciding to, okay, we're not just going to work with one producer from this village, we're going to work with multiple. Does that help maintain a balance in the community among people? And what does that mean by maintaining that balance?
I think that we try and work within the logic of the community. So, you know, we don't participate in Tequio, but we try to participate in parties and in you know, exactly, like any type of community works, and also within the logic of a community that works where everybody contributes so that everybody can, you know, rise or be okay. So like, it didn't make sense for us to assign a single producer or palenque in Logoche, and then that person become kind of like a local, like cacique, where they're the ones who are like then having everybody else work for them for the same brand. Like, you know, so to try and work with everybody as equally as possible. Obviously not everybody has the same amount of agave and the same productive capabilities, but if we're able to support everybody in the community, then that money kind of gets spread around in a way where everybody's doing well. And so then there's an ability for them to also participate in community projects. And
yeah, I think that's really kind of the beautiful part of it, is that at the end of the day, even if you're not cutting agave or distilling, everybody somehow is still participating in some fashion.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of goes back to the concept of Tequio in these communities, which is really based on everybody pitches in. And this is, you know, it's like to their strengths. Is that what it's kind of based on? Where, you know, somebody is like brilliant at one thing, somebody else is brilliant at another, and that's what they each bring to it. Is that kind of the concept? Or
in some cases, sometimes it's just your presence that counts. But within the cooperative that exists in Logoche, Grupo Logoche, that is a conversation that they've had recently about how they want to move forward, because they do recognize that amongst themselves, there are certain people that have, you know, incredible knowledge of how to cook the agave, because that's really challenging, not easy. And then there are other people who it's acknowledged between them, you know, have a better eye at the fermentation, or there's somebody who is a little bit more careful in their distillation. So I think that going forward for the mezcal production, people are starting to look at things that way.
And is there, I know sometimes there can be distrust among different mezcal producers, sometimes within the same community, usually in different communities, where it's just like, I'm not telling that person anything because I don't want them to get a leg above me, or I don't want to give away my secrets. Are you finding that's not actually the case?
In Logoche, definitely not. And everybody's family, literally, either by blood or by marriage. And so those problems don't exist. On a different, you see that in other communities where it's intercommunal, but here it's those people in the other town that make adulterated mezcal. They're doing this. We're the only ones who do it right. Which is always a fun conversation. You hear that at every palenque you go to.
Oh, I mean, I remember traveling in Italy, and it was, the same thing about the grappa, the village grappa. Oh no, our town makes the best grappa, or Vino Santo or something like that. So it certainly is not something that's endemic to communities in Oaxaca, especially when there's so much identity around a certain thing, where it's
a lot of pride.
Yeah, and that's how it used to be identified. Mezcal was where it came from. So it was a mezcal day, and your community.
In Huatlan recently, there's been the sale of pirata, like bootleg Logoche mezcal.
Ooh.
It's an interesting phenomenon. It's problematic, but I think that we look at that as like, there's a silver lining, is that we feel we've done something right in being able to help promote mezcal from Logoche, even on a local level. It's now, never in the past would somebody have said, oh, this is a mezcal from Logoche as the selling point. But it's happening on the local market.
That's great. Well, and let's talk about kind of that local market, because one of the unintended consequences of the mezcal boom has, it's made mezcal destilados unaffordable to the communities that are making it. So how are you guys working with the producers in the community to ensure that there is mezcal available for the baptisms, the weddings, the other celebrations?
There's in a few ways, but right off the bat, there's stuff that the mezcaleros just won't sell because that's going to the local market, or it was made for a certain function in mind. And so, it's been a very long time since anybody in that region was producing just for fiestas. So it's a region that has produced for the market for a very long time, although that market has now shifted quite a bit. And so people do still have their local clients. That's a top priority. And I think that there's, we try to maintain a dialogue about also keeping very different price points and trying to, because things have changed, we want to make sure that people are selling us mezcal at a destilado de agave at a price point significantly higher than what the local price is. And theoretically, that can create problems for somebody who gets greedy and thinks, oh, well, I can just sell to the gringos at this price, so why should I sell these extra couple hundred liters on the local market at this other price? But it is a lot to ask for these altruistic actions. But at the end of the day, people in Logoche and throughout Huatlan and other parts of Oaxaca take a lot of pride in the mezcal that they make and the importance of that mezcal in their society. And so I think there will always be mezcal on the market locally. You do have problems with adulteration as the price goes up. But the price going up in a large part is related to the demand for these inferior quality spirits that get sold at really low price points. And that gets very problematic because a lot of those end up being the gateway mezcal to new drinkers. And there's a strange cycle at play there. But I can say that it is not it's not foreign demand for Candido or Hermógenes 200, 400 liters of Biquiche every year that's changing the agave market. It's what's happening in Jalisco with these companies with diffusers and mass production in other parts of the state here and other parts of the country now. And, you know, until there's some kind of laws that actually control the primary materials in the agave, there's just going to continue to be problems with pricing.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's true. And one of the other, you know, like people automatically assume that all the agave is going toward the making of tequila or mezcal or destilados de agave, where in fact, the bigger problem is agave nectar. And
that's a huge issue.
I mean, and that's a gigantic chunk of where, you know, the agave is going. And what we're seeing in the United States with the changes with the TTB laws are the number of distilleries that are opening up in the US that are bringing in agave nectar in order to make, you know, an agave distillate here. So there's some interesting stuff happening here to try and clamp down on that as well. But it's, you know, those are the things that we don't talk about or that don't get talked about. Much like, you know, we were saying earlier around sustainability and the whole issue of sustainability. The one area that very rarely gets addressed is the economic sustainability and kind of the economy of the people who are making the product. So you have a cooperative, or La Goche has a cooperative. Is that a recent thing or an existing thing that they had?
Folks in La Goche started a cooperative in 2008. I think maybe they got their paperwork finalized a year later. But really, that was a localized attempt at replicating a cooperative system that had kind of been popularized in the 90s in Oaxaca that ended in utter failure. Somebody in the Smoked Agave forum recently, I think, put up a photo of the 3 mezcal bottle.
El Tree.
Yeah, all of that goes back to Miahuatlan and Agave del Sur in one of these very exploitative cooperatives that ripped off everybody. I think even 3 lost out on that deal at the end. Like, it was a huge scandal. Mm-hmm. So there was this new type of cooperative structure that was being promoted that was kind of like from the top down, really. And I think people in La Goche took this really bad experience and then wanted to apply the good things into their community and then put their own spin on it and creating a much more democratic type of cooperative. But they also had a lot of problems in you know, actually functioning. So it took
cooperatives
about 10
are
years.
Hard. Yeah. The cooperative model, you really, I mean, you really have to be dedicated to that model to truly make it work. You know,
they look at the system of Tequio. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of like the reference point for their model. So it makes sense in that situation.
Yeah, it actually, you know, what's funny or like interesting about the cooperative is that they are completely functional on the one hand because within the community there's this history of Tequio and they're extremely organized. However, there is an extreme lack of knowledge about the fiscal and legal framework, or like how to actually manage and take advantage of the fiscal benefits that they have as a cooperative. So, you know, something that we've been trying to do has been having like a series of workshops around the kind of fiscal part of the cooperative, how they can benefit from some of the tax write-offs, et cetera, and how they can actually like run it, because organizationally, yes, they function as a cooperative. However, the actual business part is something that they're still learning how to work with. So we bottle and label in La Goche with the cooperative, but it's still this kind of like, almost like this car with all these fancy gadgets, and they don't really, it's still not running completely. So I think this is going to be a longer process. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like the ways that pricing is set and meetings run, it's very much
all decision
making is happening democratically.
I mean, I think the educational component is such an important one and a key one in so many of the different communities that are making mezcal all over Mexico. And this is when you begin to see some disparity, like in the north in Durango, where there has traditionally been more money, more people having access to longer term education and possibilities of going to college, whereas in Oaxaca that has been more limited in terms of just people completing high school and let alone going to university. It's changing a little bit, but that kind of inequality exists. And for me, it's something that goes to the heart of some of the unfairness when we talk about extractive policies of people who are able to go to Oaxaca, be them Mexican nationals or foreigners from outside of Mexico, who have a lot of degrees and who are able to just financially come at it from a very different place than people who have not had the advantage of learning how to create spreadsheets, perhaps, just to track basic costs of production to get a fair price of what they're selling for. So, I mean, you're saying you're doing some classes, but like now that there is internet, Wi-Fi in the community, is there like discussion about how to access any online coursework for basic business classes, or is this anything that they have started talking about in the cooperative?
They're not amongst themselves. I don't know if anybody of like the core members really has the time at this point. People are pretty dedicated to the field. There's a lot of responsibility there. But the younger generation is actually studying business administration. I mean, talking about changes happening in this last generation of like people under the age of 22, something like that, like everything changed. Where now, if you're coming of age, you can consider what type of education you would like. If you want to pursue extracurricular activities, there's money for that. I mean, kids are living a very like different type of social life than their siblings were.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Access to social media. It's like on the one hand, we make a lot of fun of it, but on the other hand, it like certainly opens up a world, to people to see what the possibilities are there and to take a little bit more agency over what it is they would like to do.
Yeah, there's actually a university just a few kilometers away from La Noche. And
that's where the new university is.
Yeah, so the proximity is incredible, but it wasn't a realistic possibility for most people not that long ago.
For sure, and I think that the difference between kind of the generation of older producers that we work with and the ones who are kind of at the seat of, at the table, sitting at the table of the cooperative, is that they are very enthusiastic about participating in any type of workshop, but they're really passionate about plants and about agriculture. And then it's kind of the younger generation who are more interested in the market and in building the business and getting the brand and figuring out that part. But yeah, there are kind of, at this point, some limitations in terms of resources and time. And so it's the younger folks who are, 19, 20, who are in university and actually studying business administration, who are the ones kind of whispering in their parents' ears about like what things mean.
And do you get a sense that this is a generation that will stay in the community, or will they move on?
I think it's going to be difficult for us, for the young women, perhaps, to stay. But for the young men, I think that a lot of them are really poised to stay in the community. And the reason why I make that differentiation is because I think that for some of the young women, they feel like their voices aren't heard in the same way within their own community. Mm-hmm. And that they face a bit of like machismo, and we'll kind of see what happens. I think that the women who have children already, who are younger, like they stay, and then the younger women who have yet to have families are questioning what's happening.
I know of my female friends in Oaxaca, like they are in their 30s and they have definitely stepped back. They're not necessarily interested in getting married or having kids. And this is a huge change. And I was just kind of smiling a little bit because I'm just like, yes, just so many women around the world feel the same way in terms of not being listened to or being taken seriously. That we all have a similar problems. But so one of the other things I wanted to kind of talk to you guys about was your relationships with the community in terms of what that has meant in like involvement beyond just this business relationship that you have, but how have you integrated like more personally or emotionally with the community beyond just the Neta Spirits connection?
In quite a few ways, and it's grown over the course of time. But sometimes the invitations to show up and be present, it's not so much a suggestion or a request as it is sort of a demand that your presence is to participate in certain things.
So not to interrupt you, but how do you learn that? Like, this is an interesting thing because there's so much stuff between what's said. So how did you learn?
I was really lucky actually that I had a friend in San Mateo, Prospero, whose mother's Mexican, father's from Chicago, but he's been there since the 60s. And Prospero was born and raised in Miahuatlan, and so he was my cultural translator for a lot of Miahuatlan questions. And eventually, when people started asking about me being a padrino, I didn't understand exactly what all of this could entail. And there are like different types of padrinos for different occasions and events, and they carry certain, implications over the course of time. And, I don't think either of us have been asked to be a padrino or madrina from baptism, which is like lifelong real responsibility. But yeah, for graduations and for certain events, certain parties, certain functions where you're asked to contribute both financially and with your presence. And most of the time that's really just a ton of fun. So it's, but it does require, being there and engaging in a real fashion and creating, real relationships. It's not just like, oh, I'm here to buy something, I'll see you next time I need something from you. But it is very much a two-way street.
So why do you think that's important in terms of when you're developing a business or a brand? Why does that level of commitment and involvement matter?
Important to us.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's like necessarily.
It's probably not important to the bottom line of.
About like the business aspect. I think it's just important to us as people, and because it's important to, having relationships with people that you're building your life with, essentially, it makes sense. And also.
We enjoy it as well. It's really fun having friends.
Exactly.
To go out for barbacoa, or anytime anybody's getting married, you know, there's just a lot of celebrations, and it's very, I think both feel very privileged in being able to participate in that people, you know, include us in certain things. So
do you think that there's a learning lesson here for other people who are working in mezcal? Like, I mean, what are the positives beyond the personal enrichment that you have, but how, you know, developing that depth of a relationship with a community that you work with?
There are a lot of positives. One really simple one that we kind of talked about is a different distribution of money and work around the community, which has all kinds of consequences. But from our perspective as well, as people who are commercializing and trying to, at the end of the day, really kind of like educating is a huge part of it. It's really helpful, I think, that we're able to integrate ourselves as much as possible into one particular place to learn as much about what they're doing, because as Niki said, Oaxaca is so diverse, and just even within Michoacan, the geography changes, the culture changes. Sometimes the plants change and the process changes. It's just too much to try to, I think, overextend ourselves, and by sticking with this one particular place, it allows us for a richer understanding of everything that we're trying to do. And it is definitely a learning process. I mean, probably every time we go out, we each learn something new. It's never getting old. I can't imagine a day when I wouldn't continue learning
something about mezcal or community or whatever. I mean, so Niki, is your experience in terms of developing the relationships with the community a little bit different than Max, given that you're a foreign female?
Yeah, I think that it is, and I think that certainly something that's been interesting to observe is, you know, Max's partner Daphne. She's an anthropologist and was doing her master's degree and did a lot of her field work in Logoche as well. And so she, having spent so much time in Logoche and having the, you know, ability to like stay overnight and spend a lot of time with Mohanes and Paula, has a kind of access or intimacy with some of the women in the community that I am only just starting to have because of the nature of the way that business happens. So like, you know, I'm there with Max and we're talking about business. And so I sit at the table with the men. And when you go to, I mean, typically in Logoche, it's the women who are preparing food, and they often sit separately from the men. So I've definitely felt kind of, it's been like a slower process of like this, you know, unveiling. And I also think that there's a different relationship that I can have with some of the younger men than with some of the older men. I think that there's a tremendous amount of respect, and, you know, I feel like people feel comfortable, you know, doing business with me and making deals with me. However, I sense that there's shifts happening generationally, and you see that in the relationship that, you know, some of the younger producers that we work with have with their female cousins, and there's a lot more openness and ability to kind of like work together. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I think that also having WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, all these things open things up in a different way where people might feel uncomfortable asking you something when everyone else is around, but then they'll send you a message. And
that's funny.
Like, you know, send you the names. Yeah, no, I think it's all, you know, pretty enriching and interesting, and everybody's getting a little bit of like a window into each other's lives. And I think that what's also interesting about conceiving or conceptualizing like the region of Michoacan is that people, you know, the people that we work with in a lot of cases haven't traveled within the state at all, but they've crossed the border into the States, you know, and have worked in, you know, Alabama and Los Cabos and, you know, also and have some crazy stories. And so there's this understanding also that, you know, is reflected back about like what it means to be American. What is it like to be in the States? That also informs the way that people work. And so even in the cooperative, as we're, you know, putting in more quality control systems and all these things, people have, they've been working at chicken packing plants in Alabama, and like, you know, time cards, like all these things that you're just, it's really interesting to see how, yeah, it's just, everything's it's all very complex. The way that we really and the way that, you know, all these technologies that are intervening, the way migration impacts the way that we relate to one another.
No, you know, there's part of me when I think about, you know, the pandemic and just kind of the impact. I'm like, is this one of the big from a higher being saying you should not be traveling the way that you guys are traveling, you know? And, you know, just to stop and think about how the instant access that we now have to things, and what that kind of means in communities that have been so steeped in tradition. You know, there's the positive and then there's the negative of what is happening. But I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions with you guys. And, you know, folks can ask questions through the chat function or through the Q&A. But, you know, to just start loading some stuff in, I will say that the one thing that I was very blessed with when I first began traveling to Oaxaca in 2003 was I made a set, or I got to be friends with a set of Oaxacan women. And that opened a world and an experience in a very different way. Kind of having that relationship right off the bat with Oaxacan women. And especially as a foreign woman traveling at that time in Oaxaca, where most everybody was just out partying and getting drunk. But to have this kind of very stable base of Oaxacan girlfriends just changed everything for me in the relationships that ultimately developed on stuff. But it is, you know, I think things happen for a reason, you know. So back in the early days when we were all doing what we were doing and how that kind of evolved and grew, you know, made things much more organic and not forced. And so there was just this evolution that has enabled, I think, you guys to succeed in ways that are very different from other people's experiences of how you really went about the long-term idea of it. I mean, I think, Niki, there was probably a big game-changing moment when you were involved with oh God, I'm having a senior moment right now, the project in Tulum, Renee, I'm forgetting.
Noma, yeah.
Yeah, with Noma there, and that you were really instrumental in helping curate the Mezcal program that they had.
Yeah.
What a difference that made, not only for you guys, but also Eric Rodriguez and a few other people. And
Niki brought out Lalo.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it kind of like lit a fire under us, but also like was, I was, working at Amaya in Mexico City with their opening. So Amaya is Yair Tejas' natural wine bar and restaurant in Mexico City. And at that time, Mads Kleppe, who's the sommelier at Noma, came through, and Yair introduced us and was like, "You gotta work with Niki," and you know, blah blah blah. And I remember getting a call like 3 months later, and I'm like, "Okay, we're gonna hire you to take Mads around." And yeah, it was a time where I was still very much like learning a lot about mezcal, and so I immediately called Sylvia and Marco, and
At Mezcaliteca, yeah.
Yes, Mezcaliteca, Alma Mezcalera, Chucho from Archivo Maguey, and Lalo, of course, from La Locura. And Mads and I went out to visit Lalo, and as anybody who's gone to see Lalo, you immediately kind of like are like your jaw is like on the floor, and you're like, oh my God, I know nothing, and this person is so brilliant, and so Mads was like in love. I was like, oh my God, we have to bring him, and so we brought we flew Lalo out to Tulum and did the training, the mezcal training with him, and all these other beautiful mezcals, and along with stuff from Neta. Yep. And that was really wonderful and exciting. People just like thrilled and transformed. So yeah.
I can imagine. I have a couple of really great questions from Veronica, who first asked the question, why do people drink mezcal in Oaxaca? I mean, I think and going to kind of like what type of relationship do people have with herbs and mezcal? Like what brings people to drink mezcal in Oaxaca? And then the second part of the question is how the younger generation is more interested in building a brand and a business, and kind of how are they doing that, and what are the challenges that they face? So 2 questions there.
Sure. Well, people drink mezcal for every possible reason you can imagine in Oaxaca. There's the popular dicho that probably most people here know, for everything good mezcal, everything bad, but
as well, yeah.
So it really is like pa todo bien, pa todo mal, and then the extension of that dicho is cuando no hay remedio, when there's not a cure, a remedy, un litro y medio. So you drink a liter and a half. It's in Logoche. Men who are going out to the fields might kind of start their day with the mezcal after or right before a little breakfast. That's like an aperitif. That food enters well, and then you have this energy to go work in the field. So there is this there's the manual labor component of mezcal, gives you a little strength and energy to go out and do things. Of course, in the context of food, but on a broader social level, it's for having a conversation with somebody, for inviting somebody into your home, or a conversation with a friend, or any kind of intimate experience that you want to share. Mezcal helps facilitate that.
Yeah, hence the name Neta, which means the real deal, the truth, but can also be used as a verb. So to netear is really, like you imbibe mezcal and you're like speaking really from your heart. It's that soul talk when you're under the influence of mezcal. So
yeah, experienced that before.
You've been there before. Yeah. And then the second part of the question as to what the challenge is.
Before that, the celebrations.
Oh, celebrations, yes. Party.
Super important. You have your birthdays are really kind of secondary. People celebrate that amongst the families, and I think it's changing with time. But the big community, like Fiesta del Santo, that kind of thing, the patron saint fiestas, all of the religious ceremonies and happenings, the weddings, the baptisms, it's really kind of a never-ending. We actually are still working on developing a calendar of events and fiestas to kind of work around, because it's last year, right?
Yeah,
it's fairly fixed, but there's always something happening. So,
I was going to say the one with the circles around them, or something is happening.
Yeah, these are the fiestas, but the circle one is a mezcal production, and so this is actually Celso, one of the producers. His daughter Gloria was interning with us last year, and she's studying business administration. So I asked her if she could please put a calendar together so we would know when all the parties were, and like when people weren't going to be able to do certain things because they were going to be in the field or partying. And so it's pretty, I mean, there's not a whole lot of time.
February is
the only month that people aren't really like working, either producing mezcal or partying or planting corn.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's always festive occasions, and even the way people relate to death here is, I think, a little bit different than most folks in the States do. And so even that becomes kind of a celebration of life. And of course, there's a lot of mezcal velorios. Unfortunately, I provided some mezcal to a friend in the mountains not that long ago for his uncle's velorio, a COVID death. But mezcal is just kind of omnipresent in daily life.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second part of the question about the business, the challenges for the younger people trying to do their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think the greatest challenges, they're changing now with infrastructures changing as you have like actual access to the internet. Because if you want to do anything fiscally, you have to have an internet connection. So just there. But you still have a disconnect with the kind of central bureaucracy of Oaxaca City and Mexico City.
Yeah, and then I mean, there's the very kind of like real aspects of infrastructure and basic infrastructure, and then like this, it's very difficult to understand tax law here if you don't have a full-time accountant. Like the managing or like navigating, trying to make a business or constitute a company, and then understanding all the tax implications of being a producer of alcohol is very complicated. Then you have the other part, which is that, we still live in a caste system. I mean, this is something in which, you need to have a certain level of access to markets and to people with connections in restaurants. And if you didn't grow up going to school with folks who have access to capital or who own restaurants and who, travel, it's hard to get a leg up, or get your foot in the door. So, if you want to grow an international brand, we're obviously riding on a lot of privilege as well. So, there's a lot of challenges to completely integrating vertically.
Yeah.
So.
And then, there's
the desire is
there,
which is something that is kind of nascent,
right?
Because they're happening all these changes. Kids are now seeing, well, now in some cases themselves are making really good money, but definitely seeing their parents make really good money and remembering just a few years ago, life was kind of different. And so there's a different incentive to pursue that avenue. Whereas in the past, people would have thought, like, why go through all of this when you're probably not going to even make any money because agave is not worth anything. But now, even if you maybe don't have those connections initially, there's potential in what you do, and you can get there. So I think that the younger folks are all working on their own labels and that kind of thing. There should be different sort of unofficial lines around pretty soon.
That'll be awesome. So that begs the question of what impact has COVID had in terms of the economics of product. Are people producing? Are people buying? Like, what has been the community impact?
I think a lot of the local sales have fallen off. There's still a local market, people drink, but you don't have these huge parties happening every weekend. And that's where the big money was, and your big customers were the people throwing these parties. And so, it's a different type of income. I think we're very fortunate that we've been able to keep working and keep selling in the States through our import partners. Pueblo de Sabor in California and PM for the rest of the country. And that's, kept us buying in Mogoche. And so folks in Mogoche are still seeing sales, but it's really just kind of, I think, principally to us, just because the local culture is not not what it should be with COVID.
Mm-hmm. Do you see at one point in the future the fiestas and celebrations might be returning to the villages? Or
yeah, I can't imagine life without fiestas and bailes and jaripeos. I really can't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm assuming that they happen somewhat.
I mean, in San Juan del Rio, they had a huge party for their patron saint on January 6th, and half the town got COVID and like dozens of deaths. And so it's still happening, but then
there's
this happens.
Major consequences. But yeah, but I mean, people are still definitely partying.
Yeah.
And depending on.
It's really kind of the like focal point of community life in a lot of ways. It's the party, the organization around the party,
the cooking,
and then that connects in with all the plantings and the cultivations, and it's really like an all-encompassing scenario where the party.
Yeah, it's a world vision. It's a cosmovision, you know.
I mean, I was trying to imagine how social distancing would even happen in Mexico, knowing, number one, the physicality of people in general with one another, and then just that closeness that exists, you know, with the community celebrations and beyond. There's another question going back to who, you know, like, why do people drink, but who drinks mezcal in Oaxaca? Do you see like generational differences in this, or?
I haven't had any conversations in the city with like 60, 70 plus folks recently about mezcal. Like 5-6 years ago, it was still the like poor man's, the drink of like the dirty Indian. There was still like really racist vocabulary and thoughts attached to mezcal. The colonial history was very heavy. So I'm sure there have been some changes, but probably more with the younger generation in the city that is definitely drinking more mezcal than anything else. And then in the campo, there's also much more mezcal being consumed with pride.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was always done, but now at the parties, because the cost has gone up and the cost of beers, what it is, it also carries like a status, bringing in that now expensive liter of mezcal and sharing with your friends. So there's some changing dynamics.
No, I mean,
but in terms of popular consumption, like most people, I think, drink mezcal in the rural areas. It's just not always good mezcal. There's a lot of adulterated mezcal.
Yeah, I mean, that is very true. I always try to give credit whenever I can to Felix Monterosa in opening Mezcales Quiche, and doing that at a time in which mezcal was not popular. It was the old person's drink. It was dying out. There were not mezcalerias in Oaxaca. There was very little interest in it. And his opening that mezcaleria and being an art student and bringing in the other art students and like, you know, that kind of young, you know, bohemian crowd that really sparked among young people in Oaxaca a renewed interest. And then you kind of saw how that filtered back to Mexico City and art students there.
Yeah, I remember I was studied abroad in Oaxaca in 2005. And so I remember that the one place that you could buy mezcal, or like good mezcal, and it was like the word on the street that the good mezcal, it was at Quiche. And so he had his little expendio and like a couple of banquitos by Central de Abastos. And so I remember going and buying my bottles there. And also I think that Central, the
Central,
the dance club was major in also popularizing mezcal, because, you know, it was legendary, the parties there, and, you know, so fun. I remember spending my first
Sosima.
year.
That was where Sosima used to sell through the mezcal there.
Yeah, exactly. It was drinking mezcal in La Plaza del Carmen, and I remember it was like a friend of mine who was like, "Oh yeah, she's the one with the mezcal," and buying bottles off the street, and but there's definitely certain people in and of course in situ, somebody said in situ.
Yeah.
But as a young person who didn't have a particular interest in mezcal, I remember those being the first place, and I did my first cata de mezcal in Los Amantes.
Yeah.
With Leon.
I think it always all starts with Leon at some point.
Yeah. 2007, I think, that I did my first cata. Yeah.
Yep. No, I consider it a badge of honor that in 2012 we had a mezcal party on the terrace of Cafe Central, and brought a mezcal maker in, Don Pedro Garcia, into the city, and had bottled his mezcal, sold it on the roof, had tlayudas, had a big party there. And that was, for me, I'm like, I don't think people understand that was a really big deal to have a party on the terrace at Cafe Central. But yep. All right, I just talked my way into that one. But I just want to check and see if there are any other questions from folks out there. If not, I'm just going to say thank you guys so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it. I know it's late for you. Want to get out of the office and all of that, but this has been such a pleasure to talk to you. Oh wait, it looks like we have one more. What books should people read to learn more about mezcal and kind of the herb culture there? This is kind of an interesting thing because there's not a lot of discussion out there about the medicinal aspect of mezcal, at least in books. In communities, obviously there's a lot of discussion, but
yeah, I think that there's also, scientifically there's some questions around some of this stuff, but an anthropologist, for example, could certainly have a field day in certain places looking into that. I think the medicinal qualities of mezcal are different depending on where you are, and people esteem different plants for certain reasons and values. And in some places it's much more of a physical health, and then in other places it's maybe more spiritual and kind of more of an internal or psychological health. And then in other places it's very much both.
Yeah. Niki, I see you pulled up a book.
Yeah, I have a few books here. I don't know. We found some interesting stuff. Most of it's in Spanish. So, Ana has this great podcast. Some of those episodes, I believe, are in English. And then
it's Agave Culture is
Agave Culture.
Agave Culture is her podcast.
Maybe Agave Lessons. There's that podcast, and then there's on academia.edu, I believe. There's there's a lot of articles that get published by PhD students. I think that there's a really big disconnect between what happens in kind of the academic space in Mexico and the industry. Mm-hmm. And there are some really interesting, there's a scholar, this guy, Jose Hernandez, who's written a lot about the history of mezcal and different stills and coconut wine, and he's pretty prolific. And then there's definitely some stuff, but it's mostly in Spanish.
I know in the U.S. on the U.S. side of a book in English, the reminder that Emma Jansen's book Mezcal is a good book, and then Jay Schroeder's book as well, Understanding Mezcal, is another good one that really dives into the agaves. There are a bunch.
hard.
Sarah Bowen's Divided Spirits.
It's a pleasure to read.
Yeah.
And it gives a little bit more of like I think, anthropological and sociological.
Yep.
Really
Yeah.
Pleasure to read.
Yes, so that was Sarah Bowen's book, Divided Spirits. Those are kind of some essential reading for those of us in Mezcal world. But yeah, if anybody ever has questions about other books, please feel free to email me at susan@mezcalistas.com. I'm putting that in there. We have a whole section on bookshop.org of a Mezcalistas kind of recommended list in there with different books as well. And yeah, no, I want to just say thank you guys so much again for taking the time. And I'm really looking forward to, well, I'm just going to give a plug for the folks here before we all get off. I had the pleasure of working with Max and Nikki on a special batch of Tepestate that's coming into California at the beginning of March. It is by Aniceto Garcia. There are only 36 bottles available.
Good.
So it's so good. I'm like, I have my little bottle here. It's really good.
Yeah.
And Tahona Mercado is the one that's selling it. People who are in California, the Pacific Northwest, and then also Florida can order it from Tahona Mercado and it can be shipped, but they're only, the last time I talked to Stephen, I understand that there are only 6 bottles left. So if anybody is interested in getting a hold of one of those bottles, again, let me know. Join our newsletter and get informed of these things. But yes, so again, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for attending.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
All right.
And we are very accessible. So if y'all have questions that occur later, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you. Have a good night.